So in this lecture, we'll discuss how to identify and motivate your research question. This lecture is designed to help you with your term paper and how to identify a good research question and how to frame it so that other people can understand that you are doing something important. This is the outline for today's lecture. We'll first discuss how to identify a good research question. And depending on whether you are writing a literature review or an experimental empirical study, the statement of the research question are different slightly, right? And we will discuss these two types of papers separately. And then after you have identified a good research question, we'll talk about how to motivate your research, how to frame your research question so that other people can sense that you are doing something quite important. Right? So we will introduce the so-called ABT narrative structure. You have probably sensed that the focus of today's lecture is just the research question. Right? Why the question comes first? Well, it's because good research always starts with a good question. The mark of a good scientist is also the ability to ask good questions. Right? So in this lecture, we will summarize three important characteristics of good research question. First, it needs to be clear, and then it has to be feasible, and also it needs to be impactful, to exert impact to the society or to the field. So let's first distinguish these two types of papers, literature review versus empirical study. In a literature review, you will try to synthesize existing studies and identify gaps. So the research question style, RQ style, is how or to what extent. By contrast, empirical study test hypotheses with data. Right? So data can be collected by yourself from an experiment, or you just use existing data, and you test the data, analyze the data to check whether there's evidence for some kind of hypothesis that you formulate so that you can fill a gap in knowledge to answer your research question using this data. Right? The research question style for empirical studies does this type of intervention could change the outcome, or does this type of bias could influence behavior. Right? So you see here, I have added something towards the end. It's just for this type of population in this type of setting. So this is just trying to remind you that for an empirical study, the research question need to be specific. The statement of the research question can be general. You can say, does nudging change people's health eating? Right? But you should be aware that in an empirical study, especially considering the scope of a term paper, an experimental study that you designed needs to be specific in order to make it feasible, right? So usually, if you want to answer the research question, you will need to use a specific population. Possible that you just use the students at SDU and in the cafeteria to test whether some rearrangement of the food can influence people's eating habit, right? So for empirical study, the research question does not need to specify the population or context or setting. But when you try to design the study, the hypothesis and the methods needs to specify an operationalized version, including the population that you are you will try to run the experiment on, and also the corresponding settings, right? So I put this for this population in setting there to remind you that it needs to be specific in order to be feasible. So here is a table that compare these two types of paper. For empirical study, the purpose, as we mentioned before, is to test hypothesis with data to estimate effect, while the purpose of literature review is to synthesize and evaluate what is already known, right? And then identify gaps. The research question form for empirical study is specific and testable as hypothesis. It should imply some measurable variable. And for literature review, the research question form is open-ended. Instead of asking yes or no question, you should ask a question like how or to what extent. And it should be synthesis oriented rather than asking a yes or no question. The data for empirical study is usually new data. You need to collect the data on your own, or you have a data set that has not been analyzed before. So that's the type of analysis you need to conduct for empirical study. For literature review, what you need to do is just gather some existing study. The existing study could be based on lab, field experiment, or surveys. No new data collection is required. When we talk about empirical study, it needs to be operationalizable, right? So operationalization is important. You need to define treatment, outcome, and covariates that you want to measure, right? So that means the research question, when you state the corresponding research question for an empirical study, it needs to be specific so that for each outcome, each variable, you know how to measure. But for literature review, it's not the operationalization is not required by you, but you can show how others measures the corresponding construct. A construct is just a measure of some variable or some abstract idea. The structure of empirical study, we have already mentioned that in this course syllabus. So you can check that at the end of course syllabus. It includes introduction, literature review, design, method, hypothesis, and analysis plan, and discussion, right? So you don't have to actually collect the data for the term paper, right? And the analysis plan is also optional. Well, for literature review, you usually have to have this introduction section, theory section, empirical synthesis section, and then a discussion session that discuss the gaps and future research directions. Right? As you can see here, even you have an empirical study, literature review, it should be part of it. So we will elaborate on that in the next slides. The evaluation focus of empirical study is the validity of design, and whether it has a clear hypothesis, whether have proposed clear measurement, and whether it is feasible. Right? So the feasibility include whether it's ethically feasible. If whether the design is ethical enough, it can be approved by the ethics committee. And power here it means that whether you are able to collect enough sample size to identify the effect that you are considering. And for literature review, the evaluation focus later when you write the paper, how I evaluated. It's include the clarity of a research question and the relevance of the research question, and whether you are able to have a thematic synthesis, and whether you have this critical appraisal of the existing study, and whether you are able to identify the corresponding gaps in the existing literature and pointing out the future research directions. Now, here is what you need to pay attention to for literature review. Right? So literature review organizes and synthesizes existing evidence around a focus question. It's often the first step of any research project. Right? So even if, as I mentioned, you write a paper, an experimental study, you still need to review existing literatures, right? So it's maybe just a small section of your paper of this empirical study. But this literature review is usually the first step because you need to identify what is already known in this field to make sure that your study is new, is making some contribution. If you have a research idea without checking what has been done, and just you go ahead and run the study, and then you realize that the same study has been run before, then that actually invalidate your study. You are doing nothing contributing to the field, right? So that's why literature review is usually the first step of any project. Literature review would clarify why a new study matter, right? So you need to first understand that your study matters before you should you go ahead and conducting this study. Literature review would address what studies exist, how strong is the evidence to answer your research question? What are the gaps and how important are they for decisions? And also, what general lessons emerge after you have reviewed several studies related to this topic? Now, let's go through these three important characteristics for good research question. I call it FIC framework. You need to be clear, feasible, and impactful. Right? So after today's lecture, you can go back to check your research question, whether it satisfies the three characteristics, these three criteria. If not, you might want to rewrite your research question. Either try to narrow it down and try to make it more clear and try to think about whether it's too broad and not specific enough to be implemented as a term paper. Right? So now, the first criteria that you want to satisfy is clear. By clear, your research question should be focused, specific, and operationalizable. It should have unambiguous constructs and have bounded scope. So construct here means abstract ideas like present bias, which we will cover in the next lectures. Abstract ideas measured by variables or behavior. It needs to have bounded scope because for the term paper, you only have 3 or 4 weeks to write the paper, to think about the research idea, to review existing studies, and to come up with a design. So it's a short period of time, right? So it has to be a limited scope, specific enough, bounded enough, so that you are able to finish it within this time frame. It also needs to be precise enough, the research question. Precise enough to pin down the phenomena, outcome, mechanism, and context. And depending on whether you are running an experiment or writing a literature review, it has slightly different meanings, right? So if you are designing an experiment, to be clear, you need to make your research question operationalizable with the corresponding treatment, comparison, outcome, and population. And for literature review, you need to have comparable measures across study from the outcome definition, what you are interested in, right? So it's a healthy eating behavior. So how healthy people are eating, right? So that's the outcome variable. So depending on the outcome, you need to define to figure out some measures, right? So you then try to gather some studies, use similar measures so that you are able to compare different measures so that you can draw some conclusion from existing study. Now, feasible means that your resources, the logistics and the ethics of the research question make it possible for you to complete within the time frame. Right? So time, budget, data access, participant, and tools should be available for you to finish this project within the time frame. And we're talking about ethics. It should be ethical such that the IRB is just another name. It's called Institutional Review Board, right? So at SDU, at our university, it's called ethics committees, and in some other European universities, it's called ethics committees. So it should be able to get approved by the ethics committee or IRB, right? Like whether you are able to protect the participant, impose minimum risk compared to the benefit they can receive. You need to have their consent. You need to keep privacy to satisfy the GDPR data protection. All these things, right, need to be approved, ethically feasible. For review paper, it needs to be able to gather enough comparable studies with clear themes so that you can finish the review. And for experimental studies, you need to have good outcome that are measurable, and also the corresponding recruitment of the participant of the subjects, and the logistics should be realistic. And now, once you are sure that you have a clear statement of your research question, and the research question is feasible, then you also need to think about whether it is impactful, right? So feasibility and clarity. these are definitely required for your term paper research question, right? And in being impactful, that's an addition, right? So it's good, it's actually great if you are able to identify an impactful question. If not, that will not hurt your paper that much. You need to first make sure, that's why I put clear and feasible at above this impactful, right? So once you can be certain that clarity and feasibility are guaranteed, you need to try to think about whether your research question, try to find a research question that is impactful, meaning your research is relevant, novel, and useful, right? So you need to be able to pass this so what question, right? So you pose a question and you are able to answer this question. So what? After you have provided the answer to this question through your study, what changes can you cause in terms of theory or policy or practice? Right? So if you're not able to exert any influence, it's probably not an impactful study. Again, it's not required for your term paper to be impactful, but it's something to consider, right? So if you are able to contribute to the field in terms of theory, policy, and practice, then you are writing an impactful paper. That means it's likely that your paper is a good paper. And an impactful paper should also be novel. It either provide a new angle or identify the boundary condition for previous studies and resolve an ongoing debate. Right? So you can replication of previous studies is also important, right? But replication is not novel, right? So replication meaning that you run the same experiment again, and maybe on a different population, right? So running the same experiment on a different population is novel in that sense, that it identify the boundary condition. If you run the same experiment on more or less the same subject pool, it's difficult to consider that type of research impactful, right? So that's why we need to have a literature review to know what we already know from the existing literature to make sure our research question is something that has not been clearly answered before so that we can contribute, right? And the last thing about impactful is whether it can scale to other field, to a general. For example, you have proven that nudging, rearrangement of the orders of food can cause students to eat healthier. Can these conclusions be scaled to other population with reasonable cost? So rich cost and ease to implement, that's the type of factors determining whether the result, the conclusion of your study is scalable to a larger scale. Right? So here are some things that you can ask yourself to determine whether your research question is impactful. How much existing evidence is there? What will the world do differently as a result after you answer the research question? And how many people could this impact? Is the idea scalable, cheap, and easy to implement? And does it illuminate an issue of general interest? Right? Whether other people will be interested in your results. So these are the questions that you can keep in mind. So here is a trick triad. Some questions you can ask before proceeding to conducting your research. First, clear. Can I name variables and measures now? Right? After you propose your research question, other people reading your research question should be able to know what you plan to have, what you plan to measure. And also the second question to ask is, can I conduct the research, right, in terms of access, ethics, and logistics? The last one, impactful. What changes can your research cause? Who would care about your research? Right. So these are things that you can ask before proceeding to the real research. Right? And then here are some common pitfalls and the corresponding fixes. Some of you pose a question that is too ambiguous. So in this case, you should define measures of construct and outcomes so that it can become clear. And some of you state a research question that is too broad, you need to then add context, outcome, or mechanism. Some of you ask a trivial question, right? So some question that has been already answered, for example. In this case, you want to find a gap and the comparison or boundary conditions so that you are making some contribution to the field. And if you are writing a literature review, sometimes you may find that you are not able to find the corresponding papers related to your research question. So in that case, what you need to do is to widen the context or shift construct so that you are able to identify more papers to be reviewed. It will also to have overscope or overcomplicated design. In this case, you want to simplify the design so that it's feasible to be implemented as a term paper. This seems to be quite abstract. Let me just give you one example so that you are able to understand what do I mean by too broad, too ambiguous, and how to fix this corresponding issue. The most common pitfall of posing a research question is asking a broad and unclear question where phenomena, constructs, and outcome measures are not clearly defined. Right, so here is just one example. How do cognitive biases influence individuals' willingness to adopt a more sustainable lifestyle? You can understand more or less what the author may be planning to do, but you definitely don't know exactly what the design or the data collection would be. Because here we have concepts that are too broad so that it's not clear what the researchers is trying to do exactly, right? So for example, how do cognitive biases? Well, cognitive biases include so many things. As we have discussed, there are more than 200 documented cognitive bias. What do you mean? Do you want to plan to investigate all of them? That is not feasible for a term paper, right? And also another phrase here, sustainable lifestyle. What is that? When we talk about sustainability, it's a fancy word. It's an important thing that we should pay attention to. Maybe can be considered as impactful, right? But it's not clear what sustainable lifestyle mean in this research question because it can encompass all kinds of things. Are you referring to energy related to issue, transport so that you leave not too much footprint? Is related to diet? Just too many behaviors that can be included to sustainable lifestyle. In order to write a good research question, you need to be specific, to be clear, so that it is feasible for you to investigate this research question and finish it as a term paper. Right? So now let me propose some ways in changing this research question so that they become clear and become feasible. Right? So research question 1, that's one way to revise this research question. We can, talking about biases, here we want to be more specific just to investigate peer effect. Right? So the question asked is how do peer adoption cues influence meat reduction in university cafeterias? Right? And what moderators like price, habit, strength matter? So now it's trying to be quite specific. Peer adoption cues, that's very specific intervention. And the outcome is also measurable. The outcome is just meat consumption, whether you are able to reduce meat consumption in university cafeteria. It's a specific question that how to operationalize. And so after reading the research question, you probably have a good sense of what the researcher will be planning doing, much better than the previous one. Right? Becomes clear and feasible. The second version of revision is related to this lab online experiment with incentives, right? Here, we just talk about one specific bias with loss aversion. So the question asks, does loss framing, okay, again, it's loss aversion and also framing effect. Does loss framing versus gain framing with or without peer approval feedback change donation to a verified environmental fund? Right? Is again, it's not directly related to sustainability, but it's definitely relevant to sustainable lifestyle, right? So here is because it's donation to a verified environmental fund. And here, the researcher is trying to investigate two factors. One is the framing, gain versus loss, and the other is peer approval feedback, right? So the researcher would want to investigate these two factors together in one study. It's still feasible, and probably will investigate whether these two factors interact with each other to exert some synergy so that having both factors would have this synergetic effect, meaning 1 + 1 is greater than 2, having these two factors together exerts influence that is greater than the two individual effects combined, right? It's possible to document that. So again, when you read this research question, it feels quite different from the previous one because after reading this question, you have a clear idea on what the researcher is planning to do, right? And also the corresponding treatment, experimental design becomes clear in your mind, and how the outcomes are measured, you probably also have a great idea. In contrast, this question, right? How do cognitive biases influence individuals' willingness to adopt a more sustainable lifestyle? It's so ambiguous that you don't know what the researcher is actually trying to do. So hopefully this example help you understand these three important criteria to evaluate whether a research question is good or not.